Alright, so it is now live, and this is my weekly stream, but looks like nobody else is going to join me today, but that's fine, because I'm going to be doing most of the talking anyway, because a lot of the people that I usually stream with don't understand this at all, as, well, trying to get that, what's going on with this hair? Maybe I shouldn't have started streaming until I got that, whatever, random hair out of the way. Okay, as most of the people I usually stream with don't understand this at all, as they've repeatedly accused me of making straw man arguments as opposed to Reductio Ad Absurdum. So, the purpose of this current stream is to discuss the difference between the two, why straw man arguments are invalid, and why Reductio Ad Absurdum arguments are valid. Those are legitimate and valid argument tactics to use Reductio Ad Absurdum. Now, the Reductio Ad Absurdum is my favorite way of arguing because it shows people how ridiculous their conclusions would be given their premises. It builds a insane world. If you say something that is stupid and then you get to the conclusion of that, the logical conclusion that would result from that, sorry about that camera's, I'm trying to adjust that. The conclusion that you would get from an absurd statement is an equally absurd, or actually even more absurd outcome. Because usually, if you, I guess, take archery or a bullet, if it's off slightly when it's fired from the barrel, it's going to be off widely once by the time it gets to the target. That's what Reductio Ad Absurdum is pointing out. It's like, yes, it may be easy to miss that small little incorrect statement, or that where the trajectory is slightly off at the beginning, but the longer it goes, the further off course it gets until you get to something that is painfully obvious how far from it where it was supposed to go that argument or that bullet goes. So that's the idea that is embodied by argumentum ad absurdum. Is you start off with a small error that results in being completely off from where you should be. Straw man argument, on the other hand, is arguing against something that the other person did not actually say. And this is where we get into a misunderstanding of the difference between the two when I debate with people like Ham or even S-Man and Google it, and Lapis has done this as well. Actually, everybody in the poor bastard's chat has accused me of making a straw man argument where there wasn't one. So the problem that people have with the straw man argument is, yes, I didn't say that, and you're arguing against a principle I didn't say. That is essentially the basics of the straw man argument. The problem comes in is people make arguments and they ignore the conclusions of those arguments, and they act as if that is a valid position. So I'm going to lay out a couple examples of this, but before I go any further, I do need to lay out the definitions of straw man. So, straw man is a common form of argument that is an informal fallacy, based on giving the impression of refuting the opponent's argument while actually refuting an argument that was not presented by the opponent. One who engages in this fallacy is said to be attacking a straw man. So, let's see. So the structure of this fallacy. Straw man fallacy occurs in the following pattern of argument. Person 1 asserts proposition X. Person 2 argues against a superficially similar position Y, falsely, as if an argument against Y is an argument against X. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of here. So, for example, quoting an opponent's word out of context, choosing quotations that misrepresent the opponent's intentions. Now, I've done this to humorous effect in instances. So one example, like I did this and everybody knew it was an intentional, it was not a legitimate straw man. I was making fun of this position. So in the chat, one of the one of the people in the chat was saying something about being angry at men but still liking dick, and then S-Man responded same. Although S-Man was actually responding same to a previous post in that chat, it looked as if he was saying that he liked dick. And so then you take that argument and continually quote it out of context to make it look as if he is, to basically insult him by saying that, S-Man finally, it's playing a joke because S-Man is then saying, no, I'm not gay, I'm straight. Anyway, it's a joke at S-Man's expense because it looks as if that was the context, and it wasn't the context of his response. Okay, so presenting someone who defends a position poorly as the defender. This is something that I see a lot when talking about religion. People will use people who have a poor understanding of religion as if they are the defenders of religion. They will look at people like the Westboro Baptists and say, those are defenders of religion. Look, their arguments are stupid, therefore, and they are easily refuted, therefore religion is easily refuted. That's the position. That is attacking a straw man. That is, if you take someone who makes a weak argument and act as if that is the arguments that people make for religion, although there have been many very sophisticated arguments made on behalf of religion from a lot of different philosophers who are not so easily dismissed. They actually make very good. So William Craig Lane is one such person who makes a very coherent and very solid argument in favor of religion. And people very rarely attack the arguments he's made, or because there isn't a very good rebuttal to them. And that's what you find. So instead of attacking someone like that, they tend to attack people like I'm trying to think of people like the Westboro Baptists, or people who have a very poor understanding of it, and mostly people that don't even believe a lot of what their Bible says, or a lot of what their religious text. I shouldn't say just the Bible, but I should say a lot of what their religious texts say. This is something that Matt Dillahunty does a lot. He is quoting from the religious text of the Bible usually, but he also does a bunch on the other religions. But people who don't actually understand the religious texts themselves will see those as legitimate arguments against what they believe, because he's attacking their weak understanding of the actual religious text rather than making coherent points, which is why a lot of his arguments are easily refuted or rebutted by people who actually study and are actual scholars of it. And this is something I saw repeatedly in my streams when I was doing religion, or when I talk in the chat about religion. That I will say something, and then someone like Lapis will come along and they'll quote a particular scripture where it talks about if a woman grabs a dude's junk in the middle of a fight, well, then that woman's hand should be cut off. And that immediately acts as a refutation of all of religion. That is attacking a straw man, right? That is attacking not exactly what somebody is saying, right? That's attacking, this one particular instance in this religious text says something that you disagree with. But it was Lapis's attempt at argument ad absurdum. Like, look, this book advocates for cutting off women's hands just for simply touching a dude's testicles. Now, the actual implication, what that situation is talking about, okay, two people are getting in a fight, and this other third person who has nothing to do with the fight is fighting on behalf of her husband in this situation, just because he is her husband. Not because he is correct, not because he is right, not because the other person was in the wrong. In this situation, the woman just did whatever it took to defend her husband, and her husband could have been the one who was at the problem. There's no indication that in this situation that the husband was right, and therefore she was in the correct to grab another dude by his balls to stop the fight. Also, the other implication behind this scripture is, in that situation, it's a fist fight between two guys. When it's all said and done, once the fighting is over, there is no permanent damage. Both of them will heal. Both of them will, be humiliated, or whoever loses the fight, yeah, sure, they'll have to get over that. No permanent damage is involved. But by grabbing a dude by his testicles, that has escalated the fight and has the potential, I don't know if this is, it depends, because I mean, it doesn't mention the severity or the degree in this particular instance of what was going on, but there's the potential to ruin that man's ability to reproduce. So it's a simple fist fight it's an argument or discussion between two guys, and you come along, grab a dude by the nuts, possibly damage the testicles to the point where they can't perform their natural function of producing sperm in order to have offspring. That is an escalation beyond what was necessary in that situation, and that's why that particular verse is saying, okay, if this happens, well, something extreme was done, so something extreme needs to be done in retaliation to that. Now, that might, you're just justifying all those, I mean, I'll hear all those responses, sure. But look at how many times that particular law or that particular commandment was implemented, because there's a whole ton of documentation when it comes to the Israelites and how they actually applied those rules or the commandments in their actual society. And when you compare how judges ruled, what verdicts were passed down, how many times this incident actually occurred, and how many times it was actually, how many women actually had their hands cut off in this situation, it's, as far as I could tell, like from doing my research, I didn't see any actual examples of this ever having been carried out. I may be wrong on that, but if that is if I should say, if it was ever actually carried out, the number of times it was actually carried out is so insignificant, it's inconsequential. Like, and yet that they're acting as if, oh, this is the primary thing the Bible teaches, and therefore it's the strongest argument for the Bible. So if I attack this and if I make it look foolish from this one particular scripture, then the entire religion is all debunked. That is the false argument that was made in this case. Well, not only is there logic and reason behind this particular rule, and it does make sense given that particular society, and it does make sense given that particular time and how the person escalated a situation that was above and beyond what was called for. It makes sense, okay, in that situation, you're trying to detract. You're trying to dissuade people from performing that particular action. Because apparently, I don't know if this was a thing that was a common occurrence back then, as far as, oh, hey, two people are fighting, grab a dude by the nuts to stop the fight. I don't know how often that has ever occurred, even back then. I don't know if that was a common tactic, or it's really difficult to tell how often that situation would come up, but there's no records that I found of a woman actually getting her hand removed for doing this particular act. And yet Lapis comes along and says, oh, see, look, this is barbaric, this is uncalled for, and I'm like, it was still a step towards progress in a society where anything goes. Because if you look at the cultures that were around the Jewish population at the time, they are all 1,000 times more barbaric than anything that is suggested by the Mosaic law of the time. The other thing is that, and this is an argument that people will dismiss because they don't understand what the Bible is actually talking about, they don't understand the scriptures, they haven't actually studied any of this. But not only did, because Jesus said, I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. And then he goes on to say that not one tittle, not one dot, or something along those lines of the law will be changed. But he also called people to a higher law. And in Ephesians, it talks about this specifically. It talks about the law not being in effect, and that Gentiles were not under the Mosaic law, but they are under Christ's law. Christ's law is a law of principles, whereas the Mosaic laws were laws of absolute rules. And I heard it as I was attending a meeting recently where somebody brought out a very good explanation of what this actually means. The Mosaic laws is similar to speed limits. Speed limit, hey, it's 55, the speed limit is 55 in this particular road. Now, let's say it's raining. Let's say the roads are covered in ice. But you can be like, oh, The speed limit's 55. I can go 55 because that's the limit. That's the law. But the idea behind the law is go at a safe speed on this particular road. If it's not safe to go 55 when it's a blizzard outside, then don't go 55. That's more of a principle. So even though the law for that particular road may be, oh, you can't exceed 55, so anywhere from 0 to 55, you're good under the law. But if going too fast causes you to slide all over the road, hit another car, cause a 15-car pileup, well, then it wasn't the correct speed of going. It wasn't safe to go 55. So you are ignoring the intention of the law in order to obey the letter of the law. That is the problem. That is the problem that people like Lapis are making. They are looking at the letter of the law rather than the intention of the law. And I know I'm gonna. So whereas the law of the Christ from the New Testament is talking about principles only. It is all about, if you look at a law, what was the reason behind that law? If you are doing something that is in line with the reason behind that law, then you are good. Just following the law verbatim is not a good tactic, which is why Jesus actually said when he's giving one of his talks, he says, "You've heard it said in the past that if a man commits adultery, that is a sin. But I'm telling you right now, if a man looks upon a woman and lusts after her, he has committed sin in his heart." Oh, okay, wait a minute, so Jesus right there would be negating the Mosaic law, according to the people like Lapis who don't understand the Bible. But it's like, okay, that was the intent, okay, you're going to sin, you're going to fail, this is the intent behind the Moses laws, you're going to have these problems, but if you maintain just the minimum of not doing this sort of thing, then you will be better off than you are right now. And actually, Dennis Prager makes these arguments in his book, The Rational Bible. He goes through Genesis and I think a little bit of Deuteronomy. I think the majority of his first volume just covers Genesis and a little bit of some of the Mosaic laws when it comes to this sort of thing. But eventually he's going to be for the full 5 books of the Bible. So I think it's just volume 1 that is out right now. But he talks about this position as people back then were more immoral than they are right now. And it's stupid to judge their standards of what is an improvement in morality based on our current morality, in the sense that it's like saying someone is a murderer, right? And then they stop murdering people and they just beat them to death, and you act as if not just beat them to death, they just beat them almost to death. And you act as if that is not a step in the right direction. That is what people who criticize the Mosaic laws are essentially doing. Someone who was terrible, and a law says, okay, be less terrible than you are right now, and that's a step towards morality. And people act as if, oh, the Bible was setting the line right there. So the line isn't just, because, that was actually essentially what was being set up in the 10 Commandments, right? Thou shalt not kill. Okay, that's a pretty firm law. So prior to that, people were killing, randomly. There was no justice system. It was all kind of, and this is painfully obvious in the cultures around the Jews during that time, where it was a common occurrence, like, oh, hey, I want your stuff, I'm just going to kill you and take your stuff. That's the societies. That's why the Philistines, the Canaanites, that's what they did. They raped and pillaged other tribes in the area. And that was the common, and so by saying, okay, thou shalt not kill, that is setting up an initial, oh, this is calling you to be more moral than you currently are, and more moral than the societies around you. And so then when Jesus came along, he said, okay, that was to get you to where I am. That was to point you towards the Christ. That's what the Bible lays out. That's the story arc that's going. It's the Mosaic law was to prepare the way for Christ, and then once Christ came, it was a new covenant that overrode the Mosaic laws in favor of what Christ was talking about, which was actually a more moral position. He was calling people to a higher standard than they had under the Mosaic laws, because under the Mosaic laws, it says thou shalt not kill, but you can certainly beat a person into a coma, right? Point out the command that says don't beat a person into a coma. It's not there. But yet, when Christ came along, he gave the commandment or the order to turn the other cheek. If somebody hits you, turn the other cheek and give them that also. It's not the retaliation. He actually says that we are no longer under the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And yet, during Mosaic times, eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth was a system that was more just than the other systems around it. And yet, when Christ came along, he said, okay, you've already got a more just system because you've been practicing eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's time to up our game. Now we're not going to retaliate in kind. We're going to retaliate to a lesser degree than our opposition. When someone strikes us, when someone offends us, we are going to be less. We are going to de-escalate the system. That's what the intention behind what he's saying is. We are going to de-escalate. Rather than match in kind, we are going to de-escalate the situation by saying, okay, here, hit me again. Because the idea behind somebody striking you, right, is to get you to stop whatever you're doing by force. This is the entire reason behind the non-aggression principle is nothing by force is a moral action. So if somebody is doing something, and if you try to stop it with force, that makes you the aggressor and you are the person in the wrong. Right? So if somebody is doing something that you don't like, and you punch them in order to get them to stop doing that, you are the person who's in the wrong. So either they would bow down and either they would, quiver in fear of being struck again, and that's how you oh, hey, I made them stop doing whatever they're doing, right? That's the idea behind force is, oh, you keep doing that, I'm going to hit you. Okay, you kept doing that, I'm going to hit you. You stop doing that, and if you ever do it again, I hit you again. Whereas what Christ was saying was actually a de-escalation of the system. Because if somebody hits you, and then you say, okay, hit me again, hit me again, hit me again, you are playing into my trap. You're doing exactly, so I'm going to keep doing whatever I'm doing, you're going to keep hitting me, and I don't care. Or you're going to keep hitting me, and I'm actually going to encourage you. That's, so let's just try to get a better example of this that's not exactly physical. If someone says, or if somebody is insulting you, right, they're going to keep making fun of you. They're going to say, oh, so let's say somebody's making fun of your strength. They're saying, you're such a wimp, you're such a wimp, you're such a wimp, you're such a wimp. And if you keep, oh, but that's not true, that's not true, that's not true, they understand that they're getting under your skin. They're getting to you. They're wearing you down. They're causing you pain. Now, if somebody insults you and you say, okay, whatever, or, yeah, sure, you're exactly right. You know what? I am a wimp. I'm a weakling. Well, then they realize, well, that's not going to work, and they have to switch to a different tactic because whatever they were doing wasn't achieving their desired goal. And it's the same way when you're talking about the turn the other cheek. That's the entire purpose behind that. Is punishing him with physical pain doesn't seem to deter his action, and actually it seems to encourage him. I need to try a different tactic to get him to stop this particular behavior. That it puts your enemy, or the person who is striking you, they don't understand what's going on. Because usually people, when I hit somebody, they start doing what I want. I just hit this person and they ask for more. That's not what I want. Now what do? How do I get my desired end result if violence didn't get it? That de-escalates the situation. Anyway, so I probably got on tangent after tangent to discuss fallacies. Alright, let's see if I can get some more of these without going too long-winded into them. So oversimplifying an opponent's argument, and this is the one that people continually accuse me, and I will give some actual examples of this and explain why it was not a straw man, it was actually Reductio Ad Absurdum. Okay, then attack that oversimplification. So I'm trying to think of a good example that would qualify as a straw man argument. I'm trying to think of something that we talked about in the chat recently, and this is something that they accuse me of doing, but they accuse me incorrectly. So oversimplifying an opponent's argument. Let's say, yeah, I'm drawing a blank on a particular example that would fulfill that and actually be the straw man. I'm coming up with a bunch of examples that don't qualify, but I'll get into those in a bit. So exaggerating, sometimes grossly exaggerating, of the opponent's argument, then attacking that exaggerated version. Okay, so that is something that I've also been accused of, and I'll give the examples. So those two overlap a lot, the oversimplification and the exaggeration of it. So you're breaking down and saying, is this what you said? Well, see, what I try to do when I'm arguing is break it down. It's like, okay, let me make sure that I'm not incorrectly summarizing your argument here, because then I would be guilty of oversimplifying. And let me make sure that I'm not exaggerating your argument. So let me repeat it back in my own words to make sure that we are on the same footing. And usually they will agree with my summary or my explanation of what they are arguing. And then I will proceed to make my counter argument, and then they will accuse me of strawmanning their position, which doesn't make any sense because they just agreed with the same principle. So they agreed that my explanation or my summary or what I said that they said was correct, and then I make my rebuttal to what they said, and they're like, oh no, you're strawmanning my argument. I'm like, but that you agreed to that argument. I'm attacking that argument that you just agreed was a valid representation of your argument. Okay, so let me give you an example of this. So this is something Google had said. It made a terrible argument. Not a terrible as in the conclusion of it was terrible, but terrible as in it's a bad argument. It's not a valid argument. And the argument was something along the lines of stop misgendering trans people, period. No, actually, no, it was something. No. It wasn't stop misgendering. It was a different word used there. Oh, okay. So it's something. All right. Let me make. I'm not sure if I've got this the exact quotation incorrect because I don't have this anymore on my timeline and Twitter. Actually, maybe I do. Let me see if I can look that up real fast so I can make sure that I am not strawmanning this particular individual. Hopefully it's not too far down. And maybe they blocked me. I'm not sure because I'm not seeing anything from Google it. Uh-oh. This individual may have blocked me based on some of the stuff I was saying in the chat. Because I know Lapis has, which I don't understand why. I was looking forward to having a talk this week, continuing our talk about socialism, but apparently that's not going to happen. Yeah, let me see. Okay. Let me see if I can get to the root of this that caused all this. Okay, well this is not the exact same argument, but this is a different one that I did rebut as it is kind of idiotic. Okay, so Google it said that this is a direct quote. It's time us cis people support and defend the T in LGBT. All right, that's an illogical statement. That it's the assumption that everybody who is cis needs to support the T in LGBT, which doesn't make any sense because if your religious views are against that type of person, then you wouldn't want or shouldn't be actually defending them. It's the idea that just because there's a T in the LGBT that it belongs there, which I don't think it does. I think the trans part of LGBT actually is contradictory to everything else within that particular movement. I don't understand how the transsexuals and the lesbians, gays, and bisexuals aren't at each other's throat all the time, because they're holding different values and different viewpoints that contradict one another. They should be diametrically opposed, but for some reason they're not. So I've made this argument in my videos. So my response was here. First, you're assuming that trans belongs in the acronym when it doesn't make sense. LGB are sexual orientations. Trans isn't. Second, you are assuming that trans need help and that they can't do it on their own. Why do you think that they can't fight their own battles? Because that is the assumption being made in this particular person's argument. It's not a straw man to point out those flaws in their particular... Let me back this up. So eventually, through this insanity that ensued... let me see if I can find... because there was a section... Alright, so, and I said third, you're making the assumption that being trans is something that everyone can and should support and defend regardless of the truth, facts, statistics, logic, and evidence pointing to the contrary. It is their life and they can do with it what they will, but I won't support it. And this is based on various argumentations that have been presented against the tactics used to help trans people. So when you're talking about people, I've made an entire video about this, talking about the trans community, talking about surgeries, talking about, and I've talked about this on several occasions, someone who is trans, now they're trying to say that male and female don't mean anything, and so then I'm like, well, then what is somebody transitioning from, and what are they transitioning to if male doesn't mean anything and female doesn't mean anything? That you just completely negated the existence of all trans people and like, oh no, it's not the same. It's not. It is a very. They live in a world of nonsense, and that's what I'm trying to point out, and that's what I'm saying. The other issue with this is people who get the surgery are still committing suicides at a crazy high rate. It is way too. It is too high amongst the trans community to ignore. And yet people like Google it and people like Lapis, and I guess I do have to specify, Lapis apparently is trans, and I think that's the reason why they blocked me from following their particular, their chat, and they left my various chats and stuff like that. So whatever. That seems like an over-emotional reaction to something when I'm trying to state these are the facts. And if you ignore the facts, you're going to have a more terrible life because you're operating under one view of the world and you keep encountering things that should not be so, but you can't change that. That's reality. You're operating one way and reality is a different way. You're contradicting reality. Of course you're going to have a terrible life, and yet you continually insist that the reason your life is terrible is because people are telling you that what you're doing isn't a good thing. It isn't good for you. It isn't a positive thing for you to do, and you act as if that is the problem. So Google It responds to my third rebuttal there with, where was that assumption? I was referring to bullying, harassment, etc. Well, the assumption was made in the statement. So, right here, Google It is saying that I am making a straw man argument against their original argument, right? Because I said that they assumed something in their statement, and they are saying here, I never assumed that, so you're arguing it's a straw man. Google It didn't outright say this, but that is the idea behind here. So, but And here's my response, and this is more along the lines of Reductio Ad Absurdum. By saying cis people support and defend T in LGBT, that implies that this is something that cis people should support. If I said it was time for trans people to defend religious bigots, would that imply that trans people should defend those that they are at odds with? That's pointing out the absurdity in this particular person's statement. In Google's statement, if that same line of argumentation could not be used for in a different situation and have it be reasonable, then why would it be reasonable in this particular situation? It wouldn't. That is the application of Reductio Ad Absurdum, which I do need to go over their definition of Reductio Ad Absurdum while I'm thinking about it. So, Reductio Ad Absurdum, in logic, Reductio Ad Absurdum is Latin for reduction to absurdity, or argumentum ad absurdum, argument to absurdity. Is a form of argumentation which attempts to either disprove a statement by showing it inevitably leads to ridiculous, absurd, or impracticable conclusions, or to prove one by showing that if it were not true, the result would be absurd or impossible. Traced back to classical Greek philosophy and Aristotle's prior analytics, this technique has been used throughout history in both formal mathematical and philosophical reasoning as well as in debate. The absurd conclusion is a reductio ad absurdum argument the absurd conclusion of a reductio ad absurdum argument can take a range of forms as these examples show. The earth cannot be flat, otherwise people would fall off the edge. That is an example of reductio ad absurdum. It's saying if the earth was flat, there would be an edge, and people would fall off of that edge. Therefore, the earth cannot be flat. Right? And here's another example of a reductio ad absurdum. There is no small positive rational number, because if there were, it could then be divided by 2 to get a smaller one. There's no smallest positive rational number, because if there were, it could be divided by 2 to get a smaller one. Okay, if what you said is true, then this would also be true, and that can't possibly be true, therefore your original assumption is incorrect. So, that's what I'm talking about in this situation. I'm trying to come up with exact, and it's a little hard for me to do as far as getting the exact examples of these people, what they've said and what my responses were, because I have since left the chat, and then that means I don't have that backlog of stuff. So I'm going to try to recite these from memory, or at least give examples from memory, and point out why they are incorrect. So here, okay, so I'm trying to think of the examples that were, so we later got into a similar discussion about this in the chat itself, about trans people. And it started off talking about bisexuals, and it for some reason started talking about the whole LGBT community in general. And one of the people in the chat made a very stupid statement. They said it was that the LGBT deserve to be hated. Now, I disagree with this statement. Hopefully made that plainly clear. If I did not, I apologize for not making that clear. I did not agree with this person's statement, but I also did not agree with the argumenting tactics against this particular individual, because immediately they began performing these straw man arguments. Now, this particular individual who made this statement, I'll just call him Voltaire. I don't know his actual name, but Voltaire, a person who goes by that particular moniker, made this statement, and then people immediately began responding with things like, I don't agree that LGBT people should be abused or harassed or attacked. And I said, wait, who was making that particular argument? Who was saying that the LGBT people should be attacked or abused or assaulted? Nobody in this chat. Nobody was making that particular argument. Freddie said something, or Voltaire said something stupid. It's Friedrich Voltaire or whatever, or Voltaire Friedrich or something. He's changed his name since then, so I don't know if that's even applicable. But this particular individual said that LGBT people deserve to be hated. He never said that they deserve to be attacked, never said they deserve to be harassed, never said they deserve to be assaulted. So by saying, oh, but he's advocating for people to be assaulted, that's not true. That is a misrepresentation of the actual stupid argument that Frederick made. Voltaire, whatever, his stupid moniker. So he's not I will say, I think he is a somewhat intelligent individual, but I just don't think he stands for anything. And so this is why I think he starts falling for everything, right? It's that old adage, if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. That's what I think this Voltaire person falls into. And it's a similar thing in programming where it's garbage in or garbage out. You may have the ideal system, but if you're feeding garbage in, there's no way to filter that garbage, then you're going to get garbage out. That's what I think is happening with the Voltaire and why he would make a stupid statement like that. Yeah. So here's an example. So Google It responded, Donald Trump is stripping those people of their protections, talking about the trans and LGBT. And as far as I've asked repeatedly for examples of this and have been giving absolutely none. There's no legal action that has been taken against trans people since Donald Trump's announcement of being president, let alone his inauguration and his holding office. It is all fear-mongering. So and then, so this person named Faith responds, like they have the right to safety and to not be bullied. And I'm like, who was arguing that they don't have the right to safety? At what point in this conversation was anybody saying that trans people don't have the right to safety? That's part of the right to life. And I've been told several times by Google It and Faith and Lapis and people like that to call a trans person, like so male to female trans person, to call them he is dehumanizing to that person. How? How is it dehumanizing? That doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. But but that same person, I can't remember, I think it was Google It who actually said this. He's like, yes, he or she, whatever, I don't know. It's somebody who speaks to a robot, so it's a little difficult to tell. And it was also difficult to tell because, nowadays everybody is everything, right? There's no difference between men and women, so it's absurd the amount of contradictions that exist within leftist thought and how they seem to try to hold these positions all simultaneously, and you just can't. They contradict each other. You can't hold two contradicting ideas at the same time. So let me try to sum up this argument in particular. So Google It was saying that it's dehumanizing to call somebody that is male to female, transgender, he. It's dehumanizing. And so then I said that you support the laws that, so I made an argument to the extent, I'll see if I can find it, but I don't think I can. It's buried too deep in my timeline. So I made the statement that, okay, is there a similar law where someone can be fined or sent to prison if they call a black person the N-word? There isn't one on the books to the best of my knowledge. And yet there is a law on the books in New York where if you misgender a trans person intentionally, they can be fined, and if they don't pay that fine, ultimately they go to jail. That's the result of that law. Google It says it is dehumanizing, but they disagree with that law. Wait a minute. If it's dehumanizing, then you should have a law against it. That's the entire purpose of a lot of laws that were, when they stripped Jim Crow laws, they established laws protecting race from discrimination. So you can call somebody who is black, you can use the N-word. I'm not going to use it on the stream. I've used it in the past. I'm just not going to do it because Google, or because YouTube is being stupid about all of that stuff. Anyway, so you can call a black person the N-word. There's no legal ramifications to that. But if you refuse to hire someone who is black, based purely on the fact that they are black, that is dehumanizing and that is discrimination. If you attack somebody for being black, that is dehumanizing, that is discrimination. There are laws against that. It's actually considered a hate crime if you attack somebody purely because of their race. It's also a hate crime if you attack somebody purely because of their gender identity or trans status or whatever, or their LGBT status. It's already a hate crime. It's already a crime on the books. You already get a harsher sentence for that particular activity. The idea that if you call somebody by the wrong pronoun is on par with attacking someone, that's the absurdity that I was trying to point out. It's like, well, if that is true, you should agree with those laws that are in New York. If you think it's dehumanizing, you should agree with those laws. If you don't, you're holding contradictory points of view, where you're saying that law is unjust, but it's also dehumanizing to do what they're doing. And I'm like, well, then you should also agree that it's dehumanizing to call a black person the N-word. And by that same logic, there should be laws in effect to protect black people from being called the N-word. And then you get into a whole host of problems of any kind of disparaging remark about any group or any person that becomes illegal. And this creates a huge, huge issue of never being able to criticize anyone for any reason being illegal, which is the exact opposite of what free speech what free speech is. Free speech is the right to offend people. It's the right to criticize people. It is the right to tell people that they are stupid. It is a right to point out the flaws in someone's logic. And that's the exact same thing. That's the exact thing that people like all these leftists in the Poor Bastard podcast, or Poor Bastards chat group, are advocating for. Alright. And so this stream isn't going as well as I'd hope. I was hoping there were other people that could bounce it off and then I could actually get them to reference the Twitter page that I no longer have access to. But nobody else showed up. So I think I have I've laid out my argument and my cases on these various aspects. So the example that I brought up where I was saying you should agree with those laws, but you don't, that's a contradiction in what you say you believe. Okay, let's go take this, and yet somebody like Google it will say that I am strawmanning their position based on that, and that doesn't make any sense to me. That it's not a straw man if I say, if you believe X, then that means Y is true, therefore you believe Z, and Z is insane. And they're like, no, I believe X, but Y. I'm ignoring Y, even though Y is a conclusion from X. You can't do that. You can't say X, so if X, therefore Y, therefore Z, and if Z is crazy and absurd and nonsense about, we should start making laws about every kind of disparaging remark, that isn't nonsense and absurd. And they say, oh, well, I disagree with Y. Well, if you disagree with Y, you disagree with X, because Y is the result of X. If it is dehumanizing to someone to to take this particular action, then you should have laws against it. And if you say it is dehumanizing and you object to the laws, then how can you say that you actually think it's dehumanizing? Because making laws against dehumanizing activity is what laws are there for. Taking someone's life is dehumanizing. It's saying that they don't have the right to life, and that you don't treat them as a human, and you take their life. That's why we have laws to punish people who do this. Okay? So there's, because people have the right to life, to take someone else's life dehumanizes them. It says that, oh, you don't actually have the right to life. You're dehumanizing them. And we have a law against that, and I agree with that law, that we should punish people who take the lives of others. That's that's logically consistent. To say the act of misgendering someone who is trans is dehumanizing, then you should want and advocate for laws to stop that particular action. But someone who like this says, oh, I can have this absurd starting point and ignore the conclusion of that, and then the following absurd conclusion of the entire totality of it. They think that they can get from step A and not get to from step 1 and not end up at step 3 as long as they just ignore step 2. This is the same idea of that I have the problem with socialism. They think they have this, we can have this society without governments, or even with a government, apparently according to Lapis, which doesn't quite make sense, because how can the workers own the means of production if there is a government that has the monopoly on force that will seize the means of production from the people? That's what it has done throughout its entire history. There's never been a government that hasn't seized more power for itself. But conversely, if you ever did get to a society where property, or where the means of production was evenly distributed amongst all the people, and one person wanted to be a capitalist in that society, what would you do to prevent them? You would have to institute some form of government to stop that. Because otherwise, what way would you stop it? Under a socialist society, you have no mechanism to prevent that. Under the anarcho-capitalist society, the one that I advocate for, you can have socialist communities within an anarcho-capitalist society. There's nothing, as long as everybody in that socialist commune is there of their own free will. The second somebody starts to be there against their will, it is the responsibility of the people that are aware of it, that are in this ANCAP society, to form a temporary union, a temporary militia, to go in, shut down that socialist society, to free the people who are there involuntarily, and make sure that the involuntary aspect of that never occurs again. And as soon as that is done, that militia separates and goes back to what they were doing before. This is very similar in the American West to the idea of a posse. Something wrong was done. The townspeople, or the sheriff, deputizes the entire town. They all form a group together. They go out. They stop the vandal or the bandit or the murderer or whoever it was that they formed a posse against. Once that situation is resolved, the posse is similarly dissolved, and law enforcement goes back to just the sheriff and his normal deputies, and everybody else goes back to what they were formerly doing. That's the idea that would occur in an ANCAP society. Socialist society has no such mechanism. Socialist society has no way of stopping somebody from endeavoring in capitalist interest without forming a government. Now, it could be argued that socialists would form similar posses or similar groups, go out and use force to stop somebody from being capitalist, but in so doing, they are violating the freedom of that individual who wants to be a capitalist. That individual who wants to be a capitalist, he was not violating anybody's freedom or anybody's free will. The people who are socialist were enforcing their free will upon him, or they were forcing their rules of socialism upon him against his own free will. And the socialists, again, in the anarcho-capitalist society example, those socialists who are imposing socialism on the people within it would similarly be violating the free will of the individuals inside of it. I guess maybe I shouldn't say free will, maybe I should just say liberty, although the two are one and the same. Although some people have argued that free will doesn't exist, yeah, whatever. If you don't think free will exists, then why would you even argue against it? It's a presumption that free will exists, which is why you are arguing for or against it in the first place. Again, that's one of those things that people think, oh, I can have this position, and you're like, but that's a nonsensical position because it refutes itself. Similarly with, oh, I can think that it's dehumanizing to misgender a trans person, but I can also object to laws against it. No, you can't. If it's dehumanizing, you are in favor of laws against that act. If not, then you're a monster of a person. It's either you're illogically inconsistent, which I think all these people are, which is why I have a problem with them, which is why I left the chat group, because it's consistently what they were doing. They were saying I'm strawmanning them. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm making these legitimate arguments about your position. You are just refusing to acknowledge that if you believe the starting point, that your conclusion will be this, and that will result in something crazy. But you're refusing to accept that the premise that you start with will lead to the conclusion. And that those are if that's the case with these people, then they're just idiots, or they believe in the ideology despite reasons and evidence. Okay, I'm trying to think of another example that came up in that particular chat. So again, talking about religion, a lot of these people who claim to be religious, claim to be Christians, not just religious, but claim to be Christians, and then they espouse things that the Bible actively tells them the opposite of. So one particular individual, this person named JJ, said, I'm a Christian, but I would be okay with my daughter being a lesbian. And I'm like, if that's okay, then your first statement is incorrect. You can't be a Christian and also be in support of your daughter being a lesbian. Because if you're a Christian and you follow the Bible, you understand exactly what it's talking about, you follow the doctrines inside, you understand that your daughter is going to have a life that is worse off because of that decision or the act of being a lesbian. If that's the case, then you don't love your daughter because you don't want what's best for her according to what the Bible teaches you. So either you don't actually believe in the Bible, and if you don't actually believe in the Bible, how can you call yourself a Christian? Because the Bible is what established Christ as the Messiah and the one to follow. You should be following Christ's example, and Christ, in his example, says, follow the law. He specifically says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And if there's a commandment that you shouldn't act in a certain way in order to please God, then if your child is doing that thing that displeases God, you have an obligation, if you actually believe in God and believe in Jesus and believe in the Bible itself, if that is your position, then you should want your child to be viewed as someone worthwhile in the eyes of your God. You don't want your child to be despised by your God. That's the last thing you want. And yet this person's like, oh no, I'd be completely okay with that. And it's okay, or it would be okay because to do otherwise would be to judge her. And I'm like, that's not judging. Alright? There's a big difference between telling someone that they are doing something incorrect based on what the Bible says and to judge them. Right? Judge is passing out a sentence on someone. A verdict. It's telling someone that Jesus said this or the Bible says this, so what you're doing is in contradiction to the Bible, is not judging them. Judging them would be sentencing them according to what the Bible says. It's not our position, according to the Bible, to judge someone and pass a sentence and say, you're unclean. This is what a lot of religious people do, though. If their child becomes someone who does something that is against the advocation of the Bible or against the commands that Jesus talked about or the commands of the Bible in general, they disown their child. That's the incorrect thing to do because that is judging them and saying that they are not worth putting effort in trying to save. That is judging them. That to condemn them to death, that is enacting a judgment upon them. Judge not lest ye be judged. or as you judge others, so too will you be judged. That's the idea being expressed. I don't know if that's the exact quotation, but the idea, that means judgment is a punishment. Telling someone that they're doing something that you disagree with, or telling somebody that they're heading on the wrong direction, that isn't judging them. Telling somebody that they're doing something that is incorrect in the law is not judging them. For instance, if somebody said, I want to do this particular okay, so somebody, let's say something small, and again, I do have to go here in a few minutes, but hopefully I've gotten all my ideas crystallized here. At least hopefully I've made a clear distinction between strawmans and argumentum ad absurdum. Tried my best. I didn't have any of this scripted, otherwise it would have been a little more coherent. But I do want to give this last example. So if somebody was saying, I take pens and toiletries and notepads from the office on a regular basis, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, if you tell them that's actually stealing from your employee, not only is that against the law, but you could also get fired from that. According to people like JJ, that would be judging them. How dare you judge them? How dare you be a judge? No, that's telling them that they're in violation of the current rules. If they stop, all right, they've stopped their actions. That was in violations of the current rules. They're no longer breaking these particular rules. You're not judging them. You actually help them. You put them on the right path. Judging them would be you're stealing from the company, putting them in handcuffs and taking them to the authorities, or whatever it is, whatever the penalty. It would be imposing the penalty for breaking the crime or breaking the particular rule. It would be you imposing the penalty upon them. That's not something that you're allowed to do because that would be judging them, right? In that particular instance. Now, there are certain things that a society is allowed to do to the rest of people, but you're not allowed to do things of your own judgment, of your own, you're not allowed to enact the laws or the rules according to how you think that they should be enforced. That's the idea there. Alright. So I think that's everything. I'm again, I could be wrong about everything. I could just be defending my own personal bias. That could be just my own sense of self-preservation, telling others, oh no, I'm not in the wrong here, I'm in the right because of, trying to justify my explanations. If I made any kind of logic errors, if I am holding inconsistent views, point them out, let me know, show me where I am wrong. Show me where I made a mistake in my thinking. Show me where I made a mistake in any of my statements. Show me where I am wrong, because we just talked about this yesterday on the Dark Conservatarians podcast. And all the responses I got back was, oh, well, you just need to be nicer, or, well, I'm just going to have to agree to disagree. I'm pointing out where you are inconsistent, where your two thoughts contradict each other, and you say that your response is, well, I'm just going to have to disagree with you. That's... What? This isn't an agree to disagree situation. It's stupid to say that, oh, well, I'm just going to agree to disagree, because that's what I'm getting repeatedly from these types of people. Although they don't say it in those exact words, that's essentially what their response is. You've shown me how I can't hold these two views and how it's logically inconsistent, and you've shown me that, oh, well, maybe I was overreacting emotionally to these, and I was actually misrepresenting what you were saying. I was oversimplifying what you were saying, or I was saying you were strawmanning when you were actually talking about, and you laid out the steps that would lead to the ultimate conclusion, that ultimate conclusion being crazy. Therefore, the premise the person started off with was incorrect, but I called it a straw man, and I was being over emotional. No, they don't. They acknowledge things that I say. They accept the logic. They can't rebut any of it, and yet they refuse the inevitable conclusion that comes out from that logical reasoning and processing. And how can you continually deal with people like that? You can't. It's a exercise in futility. It's not worth the time and effort. if there was actually signs of improvement or signs that they were actually listening to anything or that maybe they were thinking about anything that I was saying, then it would be worth my time to hang around or keep them or keep in that group. But over time, it's just the more and more it was arguments from emotion. It was more and more insanity disguised as rationality. That's you can't accept someone's complete argument and ignore their conclusion just because it makes you feel bad or just because you don't like the conclusion. If you don't like the conclusion, find out where they are incorrect in their argument. Point out where they went wrong in their logic. If they did not fail in their logic, if they were accurate in their logic, if their premise was sound, if their logic was sound, if their case that they built was sound, you cannot disagree with their conclusion. You must agree to that conclusion. If you don't, you are an insane person or you're a leftist, because that's all they do. That's why it makes them leftists. They disagree with people's arguments, and it's all based on emotion. And everybody in that particular Poor Bastard podcast was appealing to their emotions over their rationality and logic. Alright, and with that rant, I am done. Hopefully, I have solidified your understandings of those two particular terms. If not, there's the links that I mean, you can just go to the Wikipedia entries, and those are pretty accurate describing both of them. Those are the generally understood versions of them. So, I've talked about this. I've been talking for almost an hour straight. And had this been a formal video, this would have been edited to out the yin yang, edited to infinity to make sure that I'm building a consistent case, because when I'm thinking out loud right now, I can understand, I jump around all over the place, and maybe I started an idea and didn't finish that, or maybe I got lost in a tangent off of one idea. That's what happens when I just go off the cuff and just continue rambling. I think I have laid out a clear distinction, and I've made my cases pretty clear. Alright, so if you disagree with me, don't disagree with the conclusions, show me where in my argumentation or any part in that you can disagree with me, then you can disagree with my conclusions. Otherwise, you're just an idiot. Alright, and with that, I'm going to end the stream. Thanks for joining me, anybody who did stop by.